Well, good morning from my part of the world today, and good afternoon to everyone else, I suppose. It's wonderful to be on, and a very big thank you to Nola, to Roxana, and to Charlie. It's a privilege to be on and to be able to share this content with you today. And obviously, the importance of this forum is very well regarded and known really globally. And I think that it serves an important role in helping us understand really two major things: a Christian perspective of the world that we're in, but also ways that we can strategically connect with that world, and our faith becoming really an engine of transformation. And I think that's something that we're all very, very interested in. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to take the next few minutes and just give you just a little bit about myself, which I think I've got 3 or 4 minutes here before I really dive into the content. So I'll take 3 minutes to share a bit of my background and the reason why I'm bringing this specific talk today. So I grew up in Texas and am the son of a Baptist minister. And my wife also, we met, we were childhood sweethearts. We got into world missions. I was particularly touched by the book God's Smuggler, like so many of my generation, the book by Brother Andrew. And just by the by, it was a wonderful moment for me after reading that book as a 9-year-old boy to 25 years later have an opportunity to do work with Open Doors in the Netherlands. So it's amazing how life can sometimes come full circle. But we moved abroad in the very early 2000s, so 2000, 2001, and we moved to St. Petersburg, Russia. We were fresh out of Bible Training Institute, if you will, and moved across. I was in seminary at that point. We had also spent, I think, 10 or 12 trips in the 1990s, going back and forth as teenagers, as part of that very large wave of Westerners, and certainly more Americans than probably anyone would care to count, that got on airplanes and flew across and distributed Bibles. And I remember stories that I was a part of. We would drive with a loudspeaker into small towns and villages in Russia and Ukraine with thousands of Bibles on the back of a truck or a lorry, depending on which side of the pond you're from, and would be, just handing out Bibles to just hundreds of people. And all we had to do was take a loudspeaker and have a interpreter say, Americans are here with Bibles. And people would just come and stand, we'd park next to the statue of Lenin, certainly in the best tradition of of certain types of missiology, and hand out Bibles there. And, it was very symbolic, very touching, and very impactful on my life as a 13, 14, 15-year-old boy. And then coming over and living and working in St. Petersburg, Russia, we began to work with refugees from Afghanistan and other parts of Central Asia, and began to see the world in a very different way. And as a result of that, it's been about 20 years in various levels of leadership in world missions and intercultural work, and things as diverse as church planting, government advocacy, and certainly higher education. And what I've become very convinced of is that we have a problem in global evangelical Christianity today. And that problem is partly rooted in history, is that we have lived in a liberal age for so long that we have forgotten some of the reasons why we live in that world. And there is a tension right now in evangelical Christianity, which is, should we use the power of the state to effect moral change in our societies. And by that, I mean specific things rooted in our theology and our belief systems. Or should we simply work through the mechanism of the church and sharing the gospel to see people's lives change? So very simply put, should the government enforce specific Christian moralities, or should the church seek to impact society by changing hearts and lives? And I find there's a lot of tension and conversation around this, but I'm not sure without a historical perspective that either one particularly has all the answers. So without any further comment, I would invite you to dive into this subject with me today. And once again, thank you to CARE, and thank you to the Forum of Christian Leaders for this opportunity. So first of all, I'm going to go ahead and get this screen sharing going, and we'll get started. Also, while I'm doing this, I would say I've been married to my wife for 20 years. Her name is Sarah, and we are parents of Joey, 13, Jackson is about to be 11, and Elizabeth, who is 4. Okay, it's telling me that my screen is being shared. Could I get a thumbs up from someone? Thank you. All right, good. So the title of this is Enlightened Evangelicals, the Subversive Architects of Religious and Civil Liberties. That in and of itself is a very provocative title, and that is, it's meant to be. I shared this came out of my master's dissertation, which I did in the UK, and presented this as a paper at BASR, the British Association for the Study of Religion. And it was interesting there. It was very much a secular audience, but well received, but not without a few creative questions. So this will be an interesting opportunity to present this to a mostly Christian audience. So I would say entirely Christian audience, I would hope. And let's see. So Enlightened Evangelicals, Subversive Architects of Religious and Civil Liberties. Sorry, I had a problem here on my screen. Okay. What is an enlightened evangelical? An evangelical is someone who is often seen by much of the world today as someone who is a little bit, we would say in the United States, perhaps a redneck, maybe a Bible basher, somebody who seems to be very, very intense, maybe not as well educated. There is a popular perception of evangelical Christians as people a little bit less sophisticated than others. Now, I think there's been wonderful work done to dispel that perception. Certainly, groups like CARE, like the RZIM, Ravi Zacharias Ministries, ACA, different groups in apologetics, Veritas. They've done some wonderful things to push back against that. However, once you get into the corners of elite academia and power, there's still very much that sort of perception of evangelicals. However, I'm going to push back on that notion and say that the world that we live in today is very much a result of highly intentional and highly sophisticated evangelical movements upon the levers of political power, all right? So this flows out of a very particular understanding of the condition of humanity. So what is a human, and what is the place of a human in this world? And there really is no way to understand this perception that evangelicals have of humanity and their place in the world without going back into the English tradition and looking at people like John Locke. And of course, John Locke himself is merely the descendant of centuries of understandings of and evolution in the concept of the rights of man and property and faith. And there's a rich and robust tradition teaching, and it's not just English, but it was in England where it was most allowed to flourish, this idea that there is such a thing as an intrinsic or an inherent and inalienable right that no power, no coercive power can strip away. This really finds its flowering in the 1780s in Virginia, in the modern sense, in which a very fascinating group of people, on the back of the American Revolution or the War for Independence, had an opportunity to create a state. And I do this at my own peril, but I would say, before anyone thinks I'm taking a side today, I am both a dual American and British citizen, so I'm doing my best to wear plaid today. So if you'll stay with me on the philosophical side, we'll avoid the colonialism. What I'm really looking at is, imagine in 1783, this war, this dreadful war, has come to an end. And these people have suddenly ceased being part of British America. And yet they themselves would lay claim to the concept of what it means to be British in their minds. And now they are left and forced, of their own doing, certainly, to create a new state. Well, they do this very much in a British tradition. And to do it, they draw on John Locke. Others certainly, but for sake of time, I'm really going to focus on what he gave to his descendants, his intellectual descendants. This was during the 18th century. And so you do have French thinkers like Voltaire, you have other continental thinkers, but also you have the Scottish Enlightenment taking place. You have the Adam Smith, the Wealth of Nations, the economic understanding of the world that is very much rooted in free market. And so this is all a heady brew, a brew that's being cooked here at this point. And these men have a chance to create a new society, a new way of positioning themselves in the world. So in the 1770s, 1780s, they very intentionally come up with two powerful statements that I would put forward to you today. The first is, all men are created equal. Now, we know very famously this is in the American Declaration of Independence. However, Jefferson himself, who wrote it, certainly did not invent the concept. This has a long tradition in Lockean thought and even much further back. But it was a powerful statement to suggest in a society that it was fundamentally rooted in class and still had, and would grow and continue as slavery, that this concept be written down in a founding document, that all men are created equal, was certainly aspirational, something to be aspired to. But certainly it was not anything that was being lived out. And yet it suggests a notion or a way of looking at the world which was very different from Europe. Or was it? This is where I've got to position this in a historical vein. If you understand what was happening in Europe in the 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, America is very much a product of that period of unrest and horrifying violence. People who came to America, in many cases, were fleeing from that. One case in point, the Waldensian Easter, or the massacre of the Waldensian church that took place, happened as late as 1655, and then there were other reprisals. But the Waldensian Easter shocked the English nation, and Cromwell was actually in power at the time. And Cromwell's, you might say, his favorite people were the ones who had largely settled New England. And so the memories of the atrocities over religion and violence that had taken place were very fresh, still very much talked about and discussed in the minds and in the hearts of American colonists. So when they set about making the 1770s Declaration and then the 1780s Constitution, they were doing this with this conception of, we're going to make something a bit different here because we don't want the violence over religion. And it really was religion as the leading cause of violence in their minds. And so many of these men were very secular or deist. They were not necessarily what we would regard as evangelicals. And yet there were evangelicals there. although not often in the numbers that many people would suggest. Now, it got there, but it was not a mass of evangelicals. In fact, it's estimated by very credible sources that less than 40% and maybe even as little as 30% of Americans attended church in this time. So this was not necessarily the most religious country in the way people view America today. And I think that's fascinating. This was not this Bible belt of religion, of evangelical thought, as many have suggested. And it's partly a difficult thing because the first Great Awakening happened somewhat before the American Revolution, decades before. And then the Second Great Awakening takes place just after, in the early 1800s. And so it's very natural for historians and certainly popular journalists and people to kind of mash these two things up and miss that there's about a 40 to 50 year period where America was moving away from religion and irreligious and going through a defining war. On the back of that war, there's this statement, all men are created equal, and this is going to be the foundation of this government. Now, I would certainly concede that America has often failed to live up to that creed, and yet it has been a guiding light that people continually go back to justify movements towards greater civil rights and civil liberties. Now, there's another statement, and this was made by another man who was present at the founding. His name was John Leland. He said, man has a civil right to believe that which is in error, and to do that which is morally wrong. Now, I'll repeat that statement. Man has a civil right to believe that which is in error, and to do that which is morally wrong. Who is that man, you ask? Was he one of the leading founding fathers? No, but he was closely connected to them. Was he a politician? Not exactly. Was he a general? No. Was he a lawyer? No. In fact, he was as close a thing to a really hard-nosed, hellfire brimstone, Bible-bashing, Bible-thumping Baptist preacher as you would ever find in that time. His name was John Leland, and he had more to do with the growth of the Baptist and Baptistic type churches than possibly any other man in the early United States. And he's the one who said that. Now, why would he say such a thing? Well, as we continue looking at this, John Leland, an early leader of American Baptists, had three innovations that he brought to this particular faith. And he did this in the American context. He was very much driven by this concept of self-evidence providentialism. Nick Guyot at the University of Cambridge has written on this in a fantastic book, which I can recommend to you, on providentialism in the early United States. And he argues that out of the Puritan concept, there was this idea that they were going to establish a thoroughly Christian nation. And to build this nation, they saw their success as evidence of God's blessings. Now, America is certainly not the only place where calling success evidence of blessing can be found in the history of the Christian church. But one could possibly argue that America has been very good at commercializing that concept. So Leland was very heavily influenced by this providentialist thought that flows out of his Puritan predecessors. Also, he was a Bible Baptist. In his time, what that meant was that he really did believe in the infallibility and the inerrancy of the Scripture, meaning he believed the Bible had no mixture of error. And then thirdly, in his politics, he was a committed Jeffersonian. What did that mean? That meant he was against federalism and the party of Adams. That meant he was seen by the people of the time as a man of the people. So he would have been part of the masses, the people who were the farmers, the yeoman farmers, and the shopkeepers, the poor. And he believed in a society that would not be dominated by the elite. Now, this mixture brought him into a consensus. And the consensus was around the idea of inalienable rights. Now, Jefferson and Madison, James Madison, really penned the Constitution in conversation with Thomas Jefferson. And I know this is true because I read every letter that Jefferson wrote to Madison when I was writing up this master's. It's incredible how much dialogue they had. They certainly believed in rights inalienable, rights that cannot be divorced from the person. Okay, so Madison and Jefferson, the men who founded really the Constitution of the United States as it exists even today, and John Leland, both believed in inalienable rights. Now, Jefferson and Madison would have argued those rights flow from something very ethereal and sort of distant in the sense of nature's God or this universalist providence. Again, they are also influenced by Puritan thought, but they take it into a more a secular direction. But this concept of, men have these intrinsic rights. Leland had a similar view, but he believed the rights were given by God as revealed in the person of Jesus Christ. Now, here's where his innovation gets very interesting in the American sense. He worked actively to develop a New World Compact of religious liberty. Why do I use the words New World? Because they were very consciously in doing this, separating themselves from Europe. They talked about a new world, a new way of thinking. You can see it on the dollar bill, this idea of the new world. And this New World Compact was, we're going to consciously create a state that has no religious affiliation. Now, in that time and place, this was a shocking thing to do. But it goes further. They would say we need to take reprisals against those who would restrict the liberty of others. So you see arguments at this time about taking property from state churches, actively fining those who would seek to stop the free practice of religion. And then furthermore, the idea was taken to include atheists and rationalists in the canon of liberty, meaning that those who were irreligious had just as much a right to their beliefs as anyone else. Now, in today's world, it's shocking to me to see in Europe and in the United Nations and virtually, everywhere around the world today that is working on this kind of freedom of religion and belief. These sorts of ideas are rather commonplace now. This idea that the state and the church should not oppress the people, whether or not there's an actual official state church is somewhat irrelevant. Certainly those who would stop the freedom of others to worship or practice their faith is certainly a very seen as a very common thing. We stop people who would restrict other people's liberties. And then certainly this whole idea of freedom of religion and belief is to include those who have no religion. In fact, we often see that in religious freedom language, particularly in Europe, that those who have of all religions or none, you see that kind of tagged on there. And this really flows out of Lockean thought, but Jefferson and Leland take this into a very fresh space. Now, John Leland had an idea, and it was called the marketplace of religion. Okay, that's what others have called it. I didn't invent this idea, but Leland himself didn't necessarily use the word marketplace, but that's really the vision that others have taken and seen, because he envisioned a place where all religions can flourish. Anyone can have any religion they want. Now, in the United States, you still have a few religions from Europe that are very dominant. One, you have kind of congregationalism in New England. In Virginia and much of the South, you have what was the Church of England that became the Episcopal Church after the Revolution. And And you also had a few other, certainly there was Catholicism in Maryland. There were some dominant religious, social powers and even legal powers. After this innovation, after the Constitution, you see a few religions that were poised to take advantage of the changes. So if you were a state church that was used to having state subsidy and state social capital, you were certainly at a disadvantage because you were seen as part of the elite, or perhaps even attached to the old British Empire, or the first British Empire. After this time, you see Presbyterians and Baptists or Baptist type churches, of which there are many, as many of you may be aware, were poised to flourish. Now, in this time, civil rights in the new America are libertarian, meaning widely free, and even lean to the progressive. Now, I'm talking about progressivism in the late 18th century, which might look a little bit different than it does today. But I would say that there is a rich tradition of progressivism in the United States, and many others have said this too. America, by definition, is a bit of a radical nation because they did a radical thing at their formation. Now, what stopped them from going as far as the French Revolution did, for example? You don't see the church burnings and the execution of clergy and this kind of hatred and changing the annual calendar and the days of the weeks and all of the excesses of the French Revolution. What was different about the American experiment? Well, we go back to Leland now. You see something called the Christocracy in his writings. And this is a unique synthesis of dynamic faith and total liberty. And Leland very much hates the anti-Christocracy. Now, in today's 21st century, to hear a lot of American leaders talk in the religious space, a Christocracy would mean a Christian dominant power running the government and mandating morality across society. However, in late 18th century, post-revolutionary Virginia and the early United States, in the language of Leland and Jefferson and the other founders who came to win the battle, the Christocracy was the actual opposite of that. The Christocracy was a place where men and women are free to choose or to reject the gospel in their own will. And in fact, he calls the anti-Christocracy is the state church in that context, or the oppressive state church, if you will. And that was that's what they knew as the state church. If you go back the 4 or 5 centuries of European history that they're speaking about, and the violence and the atrocities committed under the name of Christ, then you see why Leland would call that the anti-Christocracy. Here's where it gets really interesting. In late 1780s Virginia, and I'll close here, and I'm sure you may have questions, and I'd be happy to issue some clarifications or talk through any ramifications. There's a lot of content to give you in a very short amount of time. But here's where it gets very interesting. In the city of Orange, Virginia, John Leland was a Baptist preacher who baptized over 800 people in about a 2-year period. This was the same time in which James Madison and Thomas Jefferson were writing the Constitution. In that Constitution is a Bill of Rights which guarantees religious liberty for all. Now, Jefferson and Madison weren't necessarily inclined to give religious liberty for all because, for one thing, they weren't very religious and didn't think very much of it. However, John Leland had the political power in the very seat that James Madison needed to win to be able to go to the legislature and push through the Constitution. So Leland stood for election against James Madison. And the day before the election, they met under a famous oak tree and struck a deal in which Madison said, I will give you a Bill of Rights which cannot be changed, and I will guarantee religious freedom for all. The next day, John Leland stood up by surprise and threw his support to Madison. People say, how could John Leland do that? Well, he knew Madison. They had great respect for each other. They were on opposite sides of beliefs. Leland a Christian, Madison, we're not quite sure. But at the end of the day, how could Leland do it? Very simply, he had baptized 700 or 800 of the community in the last 2 years, and they had had a spiritual revival. And what I suppose I'm suggesting is perhaps that was the final answer. Regardless of your beliefs about many other things, it does seem that the power to change society comes from the power of a changed heart and a changed life.